The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. On today's show, I have Rhys Cohen. Rhys is a self-described freelance cannabis nerd, which is a different title to CEO or something like that I usually use. But Rhys is a cannabis consultant in Australia, is also editor at Large of Cannabiz, and has recently gone back to be a student. So has a very full plate, which we'll find out a bit more about. But Rhys is here to talk about all things cannabis in Australia. So welcome, Rhys. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Excited.
No, real pleasure. My wife is Australian, so she's very happy that I finally got around to covering her home country. So there's lots to talk about. Let's start in the traditional, usual place. Let's start with you. Maybe you can just introduce yourself and give us a bit about your background and how and why you got into cannabis.
Sure. Well, yeah, so I'm Rhys Cohen, and how did I get into cannabis? I'd always been interested in cannabis and drugs more generally, like from a sort of philosophical or just curious about how drug markets work, really fundamentally, I think. And I got to explore that through university. So I did an arts degree, and I focused on the politics and economics side of things. And I did my honours thesis on cannabis legalisation in Colorado, and this is in 2015, so a good sort of 5 years or so ago. And that was amazing fun, and it was great. And then I was like, okay, well, I guess I have to go and get a real job now. Sucks for me. Back to reality. But the legalisation of medicinal cannabis in Australia happened just a couple of months after I'd finished my studies. So I thought, okay, well, I seem to be in the right place at the right time here to do something. I don't really know anything about medical cannabis. At the time, I wasn't really that interested in medical cannabis, to be perfectly honest. But I was like, okay, let's give it a crack. So yeah, I built myself a website, started calling myself a consultant. I got involved. I volunteered my time to help coordinate the production of the first white paper on medicinal cannabis that got released in early 2016. That was a lot of fun. And just kept making myself available, answering the phone, reaching out to people, how it goes. And then over the years, ended up building up a bit of expertise about medicinal cannabis and how it works in Australia. So I've done quite a few different jobs here and there. In addition to sort of my freelance consulting, I spent a year or so setting up a B2C medicinal cannabis education company. I then worked for about a year and a half for a medical science research group at the University of Sydney, the Lambert Initiative for Cannabinoid Therapeutics, which is like a philanthropically funded research group within the university, doing like project management, scientific project management, stakeholder relations, policy kind of stuff. That was terrifically fun. And I moved from there into running a FreshLeaf Analytics, which is Australia's only sort of medicinal cannabis business intelligence and market research company. And I stepped out of that role last year to go back to uni. So I'm now a full-time master's student, master's by research in the discipline of sociology. And I'm going back to basics, basically. I'm trying to understand why and how medicinal cannabis got legalized in Australia. Who was doing what tactics and strategies were effective. And my intention is to hopefully come away with some lessons that we can take to other drug law reform efforts in Australia and start moving that conversation along. So then at the moment, I'm a full-time student. In addition to that, a freelance consultant. And in addition to that, an industry analyst and journalist for cannabis. So many hats. Yeah.
So yeah, it sounds like you're busy. How are you finding being back at university and being a student again?
I love it and hate it. I love the freedom and the liberty that you get to just selfishly pursue your own intellectual interests at whatever speed and, whatever pace you kind of want within reason. It's really challenging though, because it has no structure. There's no courses, there's no classes. It's just you and your laptop. And I work from home. So that's been challenging for me. And also, on a more personal level, like I historically did quite well at university and really loved it. And it's really confronting to come back to something that you used to do really well 5 years ago and find that actually a lot of the muscles that you built up and a lot of the skills that you had got a bit rusty, and you can't really punch like you used to. So that's been a bit brutal, but I'm working through it. So.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, it must take a bit of time to get used to. And when you say you're kind of just behind your laptop, is that COVID related, or is that your course?
No, I mean, it's the kind of research that I'm doing. So, as a social scientist, you don't have a lab, you don't need to do physical experiments. I will be hopefully conducting subject matter interviews as part of this research, but that'll all be done remotely via Zoom, just because that's super easy and because of COVID. So, it's just the nature of the work. It can be quite isolating and lonely, social science research a lot of the time. And also you tend to work solo, unlike in the sciences where you tend to be part of a team or a group or a lab. So yeah, it takes a bit of mental fortitude, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I always ask this question, but when you kind of decided to get a bit more involved on a sort of professional level, and now you're obviously studying again, did you encounter any stigma, from your family or your friends or anyone to sort of say, like, are you sure you know what you're doing type thing?
Never from my family, which was terrific. I have a really supportive family, which is lovely. Sometimes from, friends, like I've got friends who are in the police force. I've got friends who are very straighty 180, folks, good friends. And I think at least at the start, people were a little bit skeptical. Oh yeah, right. See how far this goes, which is fair enough, I suppose. But I think, I'm lucky to be in Australia where the existence of the medicinal properties of cannabis is not disputed by anyone, really. Almost all Australians in some way, shape or form understand that cannabis can be used medicinally. So, what that means depends on the person, obviously. But I don't experience that kind of stigma that other people might do in other places.
Yeah. I mean, that's really good that there's a kind of high level of public awareness, and I'm not sure I would say the same in the UK. It's probably more attached to the recreational side of things is probably most people's understanding of it. But we'll get into a bit more about what it actually looks like in Australia in a minute. Before we do that, maybe tell us a bit more about CannAbiz first and what you kind of do there.
Sure. Yeah, so cannabiz with a z.com.au is a B2B sort of industry news and analysis website. So that website got set up less than a year ago, I think, but maybe about 9 months ago. And they reached out to me, one of the journalists reached out to me to do some interviews, and I was just really impressed with the quality of work that they were doing, because it's not very common to have really good industry journalism in cannabis in general, let alone in this provincial backwater that we call Australia. So it was just a natural fit. And I had always, since I'd gotten started in this space, been doing LinkedIn posts, been, writing blog posts. Just, you can't shut me up, really. I just run my mouth. So, being able to run my mouth in a way that's more structured and useful and reaches more people was quite attractive to me. So I do most of the journalism stuff that I do for CannAbiz is sort of like thought pieces and my own research, sometimes sort of breaking news stuff. And I tend to keep a close eye on regulatory and legislative changes and those kinds of things. But yeah, a lot of the time it's just like, oh, what am I thinking about this month? I really care about, this issue. I really care about, how recreational legalization might impact medicinal cannabis patients. Or I really care about the fact that there's this huge flower shortage that's happening at the moment in Australia. Let's write about that. Martin, the co-founder, basically lets me get away with anything I want to say, which is kind of cool.
That is great. And it's great that you can kind of indulge your interests and with slightly free reign, which is brilliant. And then also maybe tell us a bit about your consultancy. What sort of projects are you working on, if you're allowed to share those? Oh,
totally. Yeah. I mean, it's changed a bit this year, obviously, because at the start of the year, I had to become really ruthless with the amount of paid work that I could take on, given I'm a full-time student. So at the start of the year, I doubled my rates and halved my workload. So we're still sort of figuring out how that works in the long run. But a lot of the work, most of the work that I have done in the past and that I like doing is high-level strategic advice, often market entry advice, often for international companies looking to get into Australia. So, I'm like to think of myself as a bit of an entry point for the global industry into Australia. I've also done quite a bit of sort of patient access pathway analysis, sort of market research kind of stuff. That was more in my capacity when I was working at FreshLeaf Analytics, because we had access to those sorts of data. But I'm really interested in who's getting prescribed which products for what conditions, where are the trends in patient access. That tends to be something I spend quite a bit of time on. And then network introductions as well, because, as you would know, there's so many people in this industry that aren't really worth talking to, or that you could waste your life talking to all of them. And knowing who's good and who's not worth your time is something that I tend to help people with.
Yeah, and it's a valuable service that I've talked about a few times on the show. So thank you for doing that.
Sure.
I'm sure it's very helpful to people. Cool. Well, thank you. That's a great summary on you and where you're at, Rhys. But the main topic of the show is cannabis in Australia. So, I quite like to do it in a sort of one-on-one style. And maybe we could talk about sort of the four main areas. So medical, CBD, industrial hemp, and recreational. Let's start with medical. What's the scene in Australia? And obviously, it's a big country with different states. So as high level as you can give it.
Yeah, the state issue is much less of an issue now than it used to be in the past. So, many people, I think, have a perspective of the Australian medicinal cannabis industry there's always a bit of a lag, right? So a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago, the medical system here was complete rubbish. It was a joke. No one was getting access. It was amazingly expensive. There were no doctors prescribing it. The paperwork was unworkable. So that's what it used to be not too long ago, but it's transformed quite significantly since then at a rate that has completely shocked me personally. So, we now have probably maybe 30, 40,000 Australians who are actively taking a prescribed cannabis medicine today. That's not including all the people who got a prescription at some point in time and who are no longer active. You can get a prescription there's no permitted list of indications, depending on where you are in Australia. So basically, when we talk about patient access in Australia, you just exclude Tasmania because their state government has decided to be very cruel and restrict access for no good reason. But, in the mainland, almost any GP or any doctor can request permission to prescribe a cannabis medicine, and they can request permission to prescribe to any indication if they can justify it. The federal government, which has to approve these applications, has never rejected an application for a prescription. And usually the approval comes within 48 hours. This is all done through an online form now. We have well over 150 different products that are available for doctors to consider prescribing. And there are no restrictions on product form types. So flower, oil, sprays, capsules, whatever you want. Even, in theory, topical applications. But these are all unregistered medicines or specials, so similar to the UK sort of specials system. So they're not covered, they're not reimbursed by the government in any way, which has been a challenge and continues to be a challenge for patient affordability. But because of the price competition, prices are coming down and continue to come down. So, flower products are approaching, they're not there yet, but they're getting towards black market price levels, which is extraordinary. And, many of the CBD oils and THC containing oil products are competing on price with black market versions of those products. So product pricing has just transformed over the last 18 to 24 months or so. Most of the patients in Australia probably get access through a medicinal cannabis clinic of some kind. So it's very easy if you just Google, get medicinal cannabis Sydney or Melbourne or whatever. You'll get a list of these clinic companies, and they can be expensive. You pay them a couple $100 or whatever for a consult, and you're likely to speak with someone who will consider medicinal cannabis as an option. And they are of varying quality, these clinics, I think it would be fair to say. And some of them are more focused on high quality patient care than others. But access is happening. So if you have the money, you can access medicinal cannabis in Australia, which is not what it used to be not too long ago. The issues that we continue having in the sector here are driving. So Australia is a bit weird. We do random roadside drug testing nationally. So you get a mouth swab, and if you test positive for the presence of THC, that's an offence under the law. There's no limits or, levels that are permitted. It's not actually about intoxication. It's about the presence of THC. So that's an issue for medicinal cannabis patients that has not been resolved yet, but there is sort of progress moving towards it. The other sort of big conversation we're having in the sector at the moment is about the imbalance between local quality standards and quality standards imposed on imported products. So we have very strict and expensive quality standards that locally cultivated and locally manufactured products must adhere to. And those same standards are not applied to imported products. So that's a bit of an issue that's now been flagged, and there's an inquiry or some kind of review being conducted into that by government at the moment. And the other sort of, piece of the puzzle that is yet to fall into place is large-scale local cultivation and locally made products. We've had a really hard time over the last few years with the regulator who issues commercial licenses and permits, the Office of Drug Control. They were set up and funded initially on the expectation that they might receive a couple of dozen license applications. Yeah, and you laugh because obviously it's completely ridiculous, right? Like, how could you ever justify that decision? It makes no sense. So they were underfunded and dysfunctional from the get-go, and they've been, doing their best to work their way out of that hole ever since. But it really did put a boot on the neck of the industry from the gate, and we're still seeing the ramifications of that. So, we have several Australian companies that do manufacture locally and that do some cultivation locally, but there are very few products that are totally Australian cultivated and totally Australian manufactured. And we continue to rely significantly on imports, which obviously has problems if, you have supply chain interruptions, or other things. Yeah, so that's kind of the lowdown. Oh, the other thing that's worth mentioning about Australia is it's relatively easy or comparatively easy to, say, Canada or the US to conduct clinical trials into cannabis medicines. I think it's probably even easier than the UK. So, and we're well set up to conduct clinical trials here. So there's lots of clinical research activity, there's lots of preclinical research activity, and there's lots of desire to prove efficacy. Partly because, and this is another big thing, there has been a lot happening, is the over-the-counter CBD thing. So maybe that's a good segue from medicinal cannabis into CBD. So CBD in Australia is not available as a food. It's not available in stores. It's not legal. And it's not possible at the moment to access CBD legally without a prescription. Very different to the UK. Of course, that's not stopping anyone. You can still buy it online. But technically, that's a no-no. Up until recently, CBD was only available as a prescription medicine, but there was a decision made last year by the health regulator to allow companies to register their CBD products as over-the-counter CBD products that can be recommended by dispensed by a pharmacist at a low dose, 150 milligrams orally per day is the sort of maximum dose limit. So this has obviously been tremendously exciting to many people. Oh my God, CBD is available over the counter. Wow, what an opportunity. The devil is in the detail though, because products, unlike with prescription-only medicinal cannabis products, where you can prescribe an unregistered CBD oil to a patient, and that, there are pathways available for that. For over-the-counter products, there's a restriction that says only registered medicines will be made available through this route. So only medicines that have been proven to be effective for treating a specific indication at a specific dose and that have been registered as a medicine will be allowed over the counter at pharmacies. And, as we know globally.
And do such things exist?
Well, there's Epidiolex, there's Sativex, and that's about it, right?
Apart from those two.
Worldwide, right? So, yeah, it was a bit of a double-edged sword, but it definitely kicked up the hornet's nest of industry activity. I mean, everyone is pouring time and resources into at least exploring the over-the-counter CBD opportunity in Australia. I have yet to see many people pour sufficient resources into the kinds of placebo-controlled clinical trials that will be necessary to achieve over-the-counter CBD product registration. But time will tell. So, yeah, it's an uphill battle for sure.
And so just to clarify, by registration, I assume you mean your medicines authority sort of stamps it to say, yes, it has the robust data behind it to say that we can class it as a medicine.
Correct. Yeah. So proving efficacy in the way that you would prove efficacy with a normal drug. So not something that cannabis companies tend to have much experience with.
Wow, that's brilliant and excellent segue from medical to CBD. Thank you for that. I mean, you touched on cultivation, and I would assume that Australia probably has quite a good climate for growing. And so is it just a kind of like a bureaucratic hold-up that is stifling domestic production at the moment?
Yes, that's pretty much it. I mean, it was a combination of bureaucratic hold-ups. I mean, like, there's a long story here. And I don't want to heap scorn upon people who work at the Office of Drug Control. You know, they're doing the best they can in a very difficult situation. But they were really hamstrung from the get-go. So extreme dysfunction, complete disarray. You know, companies have been up in arms about this for years. It's now starting to get addressed. It's now starting to be taken seriously, and there are reforms coming through the pipeline. But yeah, these things will take time to translate through. So it's partly that. It's partly also, I think, you know, we also got caught up in the global bubble burst, thanks to the Canadians largely. And that really dampened a lot of investor sentiment, I think, especially looking at cultivation, right? Because you look around the world and people go, oh, well, you know, Canada, Portugal, you know, Colombia, Lesotho, is it really worth doing cultivation in Australia after all? You know, on a long enough time frame, isn't this going to become commoditized to the extent that we'll be shown to be foolish to have invested in an expensive cultivation operation in Australia? And, you know, you can agree with that. I mean, that holds water to some extent. But what we're seeing at the moment is actually, you know, our import quality standards are sufficient. We will become sufficiently strict that it's going to become really difficult to get any of that cannabis into Australia, possibly, especially sort of flower form products. And we are seeing, you know, really, really healthy demand for Australian cultivated and or Australian manufactured cannabis medicines. You know, these are now present in European markets. And I think that will continue. You know, I think given how murky the cannabis supply chain tends to be globally and how concerned some of these regulators are with provenance and quality standards, and combined with, you know, the very strict and rigorous requirements imposed on Australian companies who want to cultivate and manufacture here, I think there's still an opportunity there. Yeah,
and I mean, I've read about the Australian standards. They're on a par with EU GMP, I assume, which is obviously...
Yeah, so, you know, any medicine that's made in Australia, which includes any unregistered cannabis medicine, has to be GMP as a minimum. And then there are additional medicinal cannabis quality standards that supplement that. So it can be tricky. But at the moment, like I was saying, you know, GMP is not a prerequisite currently for imports.
Yes, you did mention that. Wow, there's loads. We could go into a lot there, but as this is an overview, I'll move on to recreational, actually. You know, I guess what's the stage it's at in terms of legislation or generally the law, but equally, what's the public sentiment around recreational cannabis?
What's the vibe? What's the word on the street? Yeah,
exactly.
So Australians use a lot of cannabis. We're up there with the Canadians, I think, and the Brits in terms of prevalence of use. We don't have the same cannabis culture as even the UK, I think it would be fair to say. So, you know, cannabis use is still very much a low status thing in Australia. We are not yet at the point where a majority of Australians actively support the legalisation of recreational cannabis, but we're approaching it pretty quickly. So in the last large survey that was conducted, which came out September 2020, more Australians supported legalising cannabis than opposed legalising cannabis, but with a healthy sort of, 20% of undecided. So, and that's been trending upwards for the last, sort of 5, 6, 7 years or so. So we're reaching that point. That's where we're heading. There's no real legislative push from any of the major parties at the moment, or even a conversation from any of the major parties at the moment about cannabis legalisation. The greatest progress we've had so far is in the Australian Capital Territory, which is like Australia's Washington, D.C. It's a very small region. It's got like 300,000 people. They decriminalised the possession and limited personal cultivation of cannabis, I think about a year ago. And the sky hasn't fallen in. Nothing horrible has happened in the ACT. the ACT is now starting a conversation about other drugs and decriminalising the possession of other drugs. But they are a very small, incredibly progressive part of Australia. But it's a sign of things to come. The ACT was the first jurisdiction in Australia to legalise same-sex marriage, I think a good 8 years before it actually got passed federally. So they are a bit of a canary in the coal mine for progressive issues. So that's definitely where we're heading.
Yeah. And your neighbours in New Zealand had a referendum which narrowly failed. Did that have any bearing in Australia, or was that?
It's kind of hard to say. I think if it had passed, it would have impacted our political conversation. It couldn't not, to some extent. The fact that it didn't pass makes me think, yeah, it probably isn't going to affect us too much. But I'm very grateful for that New Zealand referendum, even though it failed, because I'm a huge fan of the proposed regulatory regime that they put together for the vote. I think it's a really good example of pragmatic cannabis legalization policy that could be used, could be copied by other jurisdictions. I think it really neatly balanced, facilitating access with political and social concerns about harms and undue influence and regulatory capture. So I think it was worth it regardless.
Yeah, and that's a really good point of, the more nations and states that legalise are providing more templates for other countries looking at this issue. So it's good endorsement by you to sort of say that you think that they approached it in the right way, and hopefully next time round it will be a more positive result. So let's round off this kind of the high level bit with industrial hemp and what's going on with that in Australia.
So Australia and New Zealand were some of the last countries in the world to legalise hemp seed and hemp seed oil in food. We only did that in November 2017, I think it was. So super recent. Now, we have had industrial hemp, very small industrial hemp industries in Australia for a while, but more for textiles as opposed to food. The food legalisation really, I think, was a shot in the arm for the hemp industry, but it is still very, very small in Australia. We don't, it's a classic phrase, we don't make anything in Australia. Our whole economy is based on digging up coal and financial services and educating international students. So, we don't have a well-established, a value-added textile manufacturing sector. We don't even make cars. I think that's been a real challenge for the hemp industry, which requires specialist machinery, and, you can't just send it off to a cotton farmer. Although we do also cultivate tons of cotton and rice in Australia inexplicably. So, it would make a lot of sense to get on the hemp bandwagon. But it has been really cool since the legalization of hemp seed and food to see. You can now go to Woolworths or the largest supermarket chains in Australia and see several hemp seed and hemp seed oil products on the shelves. So yeah, they're doing nicely. But we don't have a farm bill situation in Australia. You can't cultivate industrial hemp and extract useful cannabinoids to plug into the medical system. So that pretty much limits the hemp sector to a great extent.
Yeah, there's quite a large economic influence from China in Australia. How much of that has a bearing on that? Because obviously China is, I think, the biggest hemp producer in the world. Tons of hemp cultivated in China, yeah. I don't know how much we export hemp products to China at the moment. The received wisdom in Australia is, down the track, when China, South Korea, Japan, etc., are at the stage where they desire CBD products and they desire hemp seed and hemp seed oil products, and it's less of an issue, that Australia will be in prime position to supply into those markets. Because we currently, we send, they are I think our second largest or our first largest trading partner, China. And we, along with New Zealand, supply a lot of fresh produce into the Asian markets. Also a lot of cosmetics, a lot of vitamins, a lot of baby formula, that kind of stuff. So, CBD wellness products would be a natural extension of that. So I think that's where we see our relationship with China and other Asian markets sort of moving forward. Yeah, it'd be interesting times ahead. As we kind of round things off, What about the public markets in relation to cannabis companies? Because there's a few listed Aussie companies.
Yeah, we've got tons.
How's that all working out?
Fine. I mean, it's the stock market, goes up and down. But yeah, we've had cannabis companies listed on the Australian Stock Exchange for several years. It's not that contentious anymore. I know you guys over there just got your first cannabis listing and cannabis listings, plural. So congrats to that. And yeah, I think early on there was a lot of hype and optimism about cannabis stocks. I mean, you could backwards list an IPO with the word cannabis in your website and probably get a healthy pump and dump out of it. But those were the bad old days. I hope that investors are a bit more sensible now and ideally pay attention to the fundamentals.
Yeah, I hope for that for everyone the world over.
Yeah.
It seems to be a bit frenzied with people on their laptops at the moment trading, fancying themselves as day traders. But so what do you think about the future? We've covered a few areas. What do you see about the kind of immediate future and the slightly mid-term? There's no point with predicting the long-term future,
Sure.
I don't think.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting, right? So I think we're hitting this inflection point in the market in terms of patient access. Affordability is coming down, product affordability is coming down, clinic affordability is coming up. Prices are coming down. You know what I mean? It's becoming more affordable.
Yes.
To see a clinic. It's becoming more affordable to get a prescription, much more. It's becoming easier for doctors to prescribe. It's becoming more normal for doctors to prescribe. So we will continue to see a significant increase in the number of people who are accessing cannabis on prescription in Australia this year. Quite a significant increase, I think it would be fair to say. So, at the moment, yeah, maybe best case scenario, we have 50,000 people who are accessing cannabis on prescription today. We know that in Australia, there are at least 400,000 people who say that they use cannabis regularly and only for medicinal purposes. So, we've got that whole market to go, not to mention all the people who don't currently use cannabis, but would like to or would give it a go if it was available on prescription. So I think there's a huge opportunity here, and I don't see any major barriers remaining, once affordability continues to come down, etc. So I think there's a lot to be excited about in terms of the total amount of patients who can get access to cannabis in Australia, which is cool. We will see some of the larger planned cultivation manufacturing facilities come online in the near future as well, which will be awesome. And then we'll have truly large-scale local products meeting local demand. And, whatever happens globally, we'll do pretty well at the export game. I know every other country is also planning to export or, has an eye on exports. But I think Australia's got some competitive advantages there, which would be nice. But what's really interesting to me is, once it becomes easy and cheap enough, there's no reason why other people who aren't medicinal cannabis patients could start accessing cannabis on prescription. And I think that combined with the change in public attitudes towards cannabis legalization more generally, I think we're approaching a point at which we're going to start having that national conversation about cannabis law reform, recreational cannabis legalization. I think the medicalization of cannabis, makes people think differently about cannabis and changes public perceptions about it. And I think we are heading towards that point. How far away, I'm not quite sure, but that's something that I'd be really excited to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it mirrors the UK in some ways. We're quite old school in some ways, and I know Australia is as well at a kind of governmental level. So these sort of things would take a little bit longer than they have in some other countries, I think. But as you say, making medical more available to people is a great way of educating them about sort of taking away the fear, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Well, thank you, Rhys. This has been brilliant. Really good. And we could have deep dived on at least 2 or 3 of those sections.
I feel like we really scratched the surface.
Yeah. I mean, there's just so much to talk about, isn't there? So I think that's a great cue for us to do another one of these at some point soon. So we'd love to have you back on.
My pleasure. Thanks, Anush.
Cool. Thanks, Rhys. Appreciate it.